All right, so I will go by alphabetical order. Our first speaker is Christina Boyles, who is an assistant professor of culturally engaged digital humanities at Michigan State University and a fellow at the Center for Applied Data Ethics at the University of San Francisco. Her research explores the relationship between disaster, social justice, and the environment. She currently directs projects funded by the Mellon Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities, including the Archivo de Respuestas, Emergencias de Puerto Rico, or the Emergency Response Archive of Puerto Rico, a digital humanities project that works with community organizations to collect and preserve oral histories and artifacts pertaining to disaster. Her recent scholarship appears in Digital Humanities Quarterly, Archipelagos, and Scholarly Editing. Right. And then we have Ricia Chansky, who is a professor of English at the University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez, where she directs the Oral History Lab at UPRM. She is a Senior Climate Justice Fellow at the Humanities Action Lab, an Assembling Voices Fellow at the Interdisciplinary Center for Innovative Theory and Empirics at Columbia University, and a partner in the Archivo de Respuestas Emergencias de Puerto Rico. I'm going to butcher this word every time. She currently directs oral history in digital humanities projects funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Andrew Mellon Foundation. Her research focuses on the intersections of storytelling, national identity, and social justice. Her recent books are The Divided States, Unraveling National Identity in the 21st Century, Mi Maria, Surviving the Storm, Voices from Puerto Rico, and Maxi Survives a Hurricane. All right, and last but not least, we have Jose Morales Benitez, who is the Research Services Librarian at the Graduate Research and Innovation Center, a unit at UPRM Library that provides support to graduate students and faculty in all stages of the research process. As part of these duties, Jose designs and delivers workshops on topics like data management, scholarly communication, creates online learning objects, and helps manage Scholar at UPRM, which is the campus institutional repository. Jose also collaborates with UPRM's Oral History Lab, or OHL. In this role, he has helped structure the lab's digital collections workflow, establish metadata procedures, and develop strategies to enhance access. Additionally, he helped organize a workshop series presented by the OHL, which was open to the community. This series featured talks held mainly in Spanish on topics such as digital preservation, community archives, and the creation of oral history collection. All right, thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us on a Friday afternoon. We're glad that you're here with us. Thank you very much to Helene and to the other members of FLDH for first crafting this webinar series and to hosting us here today. We're quite happy to be here. Before we dive into the presentation, I just wanted to explain a little bit about the relationship between the three of us as colleagues and as friends who are theorizing digital humanities in the aftermath of climatological disasters. At the University of Puerto Rico at Mayaguez, we have an oral history lab, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in just a minute. And at the Michigan State University, Christina is heading up a digital humanities project. The AREPR, which she is representing today, is partnered with two universities in Puerto Rico, our own, and the University of Puerto Rico at Rio Piedras. And so our work together overlaps in some significant ways as we theorize and try to unmake and remake in some ways digital archives, especially those pertaining to lived experiences of surviving disaster and long aftermath. So I just wanted to say that's how this crew of three people is tied together and joining you here today for this discussion. Christina, would you mind advancing, please? Thank you. So we're going to start today by talking about these two components that I just mentioned, the Oral History Lab, or the OHL at UPRM, and the AREPR project. After we talk about those two centers and how they're in dialogue with each other, we're going to break down 3 steps of our digital archiving project. We're going to look at how we work on campus, primarily with students and student-centered texts. We're going to talk about a community archiving project that we've developed at the OHL. And then we're going to talk about how AREPR brings together communities for another type of community archiving project. And we're going to conclude our part of the conversation today by pulling out a couple of points that we think are important as we start theorizing decolonial digital archives. And we hope that that final summation of the ways that we're starting to think about digital archives will springboard into a conversation with people who are in attendance today. And we might have a fuller and richer conversation about the space of the archives as a decolonial space, especially as we're thinking about the promises that digital archives may offer us. We opened the Oral History Lab at UPRM in February of this year. So we're still in many ways a new and young lab, and we're still thinking through some of the ways that we want to move forward. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how this particular space was formed and what led to that, and a couple of the things that we're doing now. After Hurricanes Irma and Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico in rapid succession in September 2017, I began an oral history project. And I will upfront say that at that point, I wasn't sure what I was doing because we were all in a time of desperation and urgency after those hurricanes. As a person whose scholarship had been dedicated to autobiographical narratives and the study of the ways in which people tell the stories of their own lives, whether that's perhaps a more traditional literary autobiography or a multimodal telling of a person's life, I thought that perhaps I could put that experience to work in my classroom. I started with a hurricane memoir assignment. It was an ungraded assignment that was a space for students to discuss their lived experiences. And so this was entirely optional. Every single student in every course I was teaching decided that they wanted the opportunity to tell their story. Almost all of those stories were pencil to paper, and I read them by candlelight because it would be months until we had electricity again. I realized at that point that there were not only multiple untold stories, but there was active erasure from multiple sources after the hurricane. And this made me contemplate in a different way what telling stories about one's lived experience could do for the dignity of the storyteller, but also when we amplify those stories, what do those eyewitness testimonies hold that is valuable for the community from which they emerge, but also for other communities that if they're not experiencing climatological disaster at this point, they might in the future. I was a bit naive while I was working on this project, and I thought to myself, as we prepared to publish some excerpts from that collection, I thought to myself, oh my goodness, we're done. Isn't this very exciting? And what happened when I thought, woohoo, we're done, that was coming upon the end of 2019, at which time an earthquake swarm began off the southwestern coast of the main island of Puerto Rico. That earthquake swarm has included thousands of earthquakes up until this time period. And then, as we all know, in March of 2020, COVID was declared a global pandemic. And so instead of ending Mi Maria at that point, Mi Maria became Sheltered in Place Storytelling and Stratified Disasters. And we use the term in our lab, stratified disasters, to indicate what happens when a person is experiencing multiple disasters at the same time. And so when the earthquakes began, there were still 20,000 homes in Puerto Rico that still had blue roofs or tarps covering them. And so when we were told to shelter in place, the places that we had to shelter in were extremely unstable. I joined partners at the library, primarily Jacquelina Alvarez. Jackie and I had previous conversations about storytelling and the ways in which the library might be interested in hosting story collections. She and I, together with another colleague, applied for a grant to build the foundation and the infrastructure of the Oral History Lab. In that project, we brought together elements of storytelling from the Department of English. We brought together documentary filmmaking from our film certificate program and preservation from our university library. And so the foundation of our project is bringing together those three elements. A primary foundation of our project is undergraduate education. And what that means is that we offer courses in storytelling. We offer them both from a little bit more traditional oral history perspective, but also from a community perspective, in which we've hosted courses in which students have partnered with mutual aid organizations and citizen scientist organizations to tell a story that's perhaps a little bit more focused in that way. We also have documentary filmmaking courses. In our physical lab, we have an interview room and we have 4 documentary film editing stations. And that is in addition to our digital repository and the elements that Jose will be talking about in just a minute in terms of what that consists of. When we began the lab, we decided that our work would be rooted very firmly in decolonial practice and anti-racist methodologies, and that we would use trauma-informed approaches for all of our work. And so you will see as this presentation unfolds, some of the ways that those 3 elements manifest as we think about what stories are we listening to, how are we preserving them, and how are we thinking about disseminating them. We are very grateful to the National Endowment for the Humanities for providing a digital humanities grant for establishing our lab. And I'm just going to turn it over to my colleague, Jose, at this moment. And no, I'm not sorry. I also wanted to say that one of the things that our lab is steeped in is an understanding of the need to integrate high-tech, low-tech, and no-tech forms of dissemination. We are obviously extremely focused on digital outputs and how are we using digital humanities to shape our potential outputs. But we do understand that, especially within multiple frontline communities, we have a number of participants and a number of stakeholders who, either because of socioeconomic means or because of rurality or mountainous communities, do not have access to high-speed internet, do not have stable electricity, and also do not necessarily own technology that would allow them to either get online or to download large packages. And so I wanted to share with you a couple of our outputs here. Mi Maria, Surviving the Storm, Voices from Puerto Rico. One of our first documentary films made from the project, Todavía Estamos Aquí. We have a zine that's available both as a print zine and as a digital zine about food insecurity, a bilingual children's book, Maxie Survives the Hurricane. And we've also made a curated contribution to the Humanities Action Lab traveling exhibition, Climates of Inequality. And so I just wanted to emphasize that while we are very focused on our digital outputs, we do really try to take into consideration that there are multiple audiences who are invested in both the stories that are told in our projects and these climate justice and climate informed outcomes who do not have access. And so we are committed to these integrated outcomes. And now I'm turning it over to Jose to talk a little bit more about the digital archive.
I think we're going to start with an introduction to AREPR. So I don't know if that's you, Christina.
Yeah, I'll jump in just real quick. I'm going to build on a lot of what Ricia has already talked about. So AREPR is a partner project with the OHL, and we have been very fortunate to be able to bring the oral histories that the OHL students and other students through the English department at the University of Puerto Rico and Mayagüez have collected into our digital collection. Our project has a similar but slightly different history. So AREPR, or its foundations, actually began in 2016, oddly enough, because at the time I was studying the very disaster response between hurricanes that hit the Caribbean and hit the mainland of the United States. And in particular, I had focused on San Felipe, which is a hurricane that had hit in 1928 in both Puerto Rico and Florida. And I spent quite a bit of time looking at the disparate disaster response and seeing how resources were much more easily distributed in Florida than they were in Puerto Rico. And at the time, I was working at the University of Iowa, and a colleague of mine said, "Hey, I have a family member who was alive during the hurricane of 1928, during San Felipe. Do you want to talk to them?" And so I was fortunate enough to go down in early 2017 in May to speak to her Uncle Billy and to some of his friends who still had some memories that they were willing to share. And so that was how I got started with oral history and disaster. But it really changed because only a few months later, Hurricanes Irma and Maria hit and had devastating impact. And that also really shifted for me what oral history looked like, because in my first case, I had been talking with individuals who had 90 years, since the lived event. And so that was a very different situation than it was to start working in oral history for folks who had just experienced a disastrous event. And so I feel very fortunate, as Ricia and Jose will talk about, that we were able to come together and talk about strategies that work best in that context, making sure we're taking trauma-informed and decolonial approaches. And I feel very honored to have been invited into this work, both by the Mayaguez team and our team in Rio Piedras. So AREPR now is a curated collection of disaster response artifacts and oral histories from our two teams. We see these as extremely important in that they witness the experiences of Puerto Ricans, and they also position individuals as experts of that experience and of disaster response. And we want to make sure that as this project moves forward, that we see this as a model for other types of disaster response in other communities, as we know that the effects of climate change will only become worse and more communities will have to face similar crises. If you're interested in learning more about the project and just checking out some of our links, I did put a short link to the slides in the chat, so feel free to look at it there. And just as a brief overview, in our first phase of the project, we had the good fortune of partnering with 5 community organizations, most of which are located on the east side of the main island of Puerto Rico. This includes Comedores Sociales, which does food distribution and has a community center with a variety of services, including acupuncture, youth classes, and table tennis and ping pong, food pantry, and more. El Puente, which is an activist organization focused specifically on the climate crisis. Ines Itias, which is affiliated with the University of Puerto Rico in Humacao and is partnered with a number of on-the-ground environmental research projects. Junta Gente, which is an umbrella organization for a variety of activist groups, including groups that represent, for example, professors and their activism, and then many groups beyond. And Operation Blessing, which works on clean water access and provides water filters to communities who have experienced crisis. And we are very excited in this year's phase, we are going to be bringing on teams that our Mayaguez team has partnered with. And so if you are interested in seeing those materials, keep your eye on the site. And this spring, we'll be introducing many of those, and they will be coming online. So right now we're really excited that we work across, we've mentioned our 2 partner teams in Puerto Rico, our team at MSU, and we also are partnered with the Digital Library of the Caribbean to house a copycat collection. And we're really excited about that because it ensures access to our materials to a broader audience, and particularly across the Caribbean. And so we, in our early stages thus far, have been able to bring together community groups, undergrad students, graduate students, librarians, faculty, just a variety of people to develop this project. And right now we have about 200 items with many more to come. So feel free to keep your eye out on all of these projects as we move forward. And now we're going to dig into more detail about what this work looks like and how we live out some of these commitments. So I will pass it over to Jose.
Thank you, Christina. Okay, I will go ahead and give a brief explanation of our archiving process at the Oral History Lab. Okay, so we can jump to the next slide. And I wanted to start out by mentioning some guiding concepts of the archiving practice that we have developed and continue to develop at the OHL. I think a very important point to emphasize is the pedagogical aspect of our process. Our archiving practice centers content that's generated by UPRM students. So students receive instruction on oral history for social justice methodologies, as well as decolonial and trauma-informed approaches. And after that, they head out to the field to collect the stories from their communities that matter most to them. So it is this student work that is the basis for the content that makes up the OHL collection. And part of what we want to achieve with this process is to encourage students to transcend their role as being just information consumers and embrace a role as creators of new knowledge and creators of new primary sources. And we also really want students to think of their work and the stories from their communities as something that's valuable, that is worthy of being uploaded to a dissemination platform and shared with audiences everywhere, and also preserved for the future. Additionally, we see the oral history process as having a potential to help students connect on a deeper level with members of their community through the act of listening. Next slide, please. So these are just some aspects that we established as priorities of our archiving practice from the start. First, we wanted to develop an intake and processing workflow that was not overly complicated. The purpose was to simplify things for the students who would be submitting the bulk of the material, and also look to alleviate some of the workload for library personnel, given that the personnel dedicated to these tasks is very limited here at the OHL, and we wanted to avoid ending up with a huge backlog. So also, we wanted to enhance access and dissemination. That was established as a crucial aspect of the project's goals, as was maintaining an ethical archiving practice. In terms of metadata, we were looking for a system that led to rich descriptions and consistency, and that also was a good fit for the nature of our project. And we also considered aspects of digital preservation from the start. Next slide, please. So going a bit more specifically into metadata, just because it's such a fundamental aspect of developing a collection like ours, again, we were looking to strike that balance between simplicity and also descriptive quality, which is what we are all trying to achieve. And sometimes that was something that was absolutely essential to us, was having bilingual metadata in English and Spanish. The content of our collection is mostly produced by students who are participating in English courses, but we wanted the collection to be accessible and searchable by everyone in the Puerto Rican community. So that aspect of bilingual metadata was crucial. And we've also done our best to teach students about the importance of supplying rich descriptions for their oral histories in order to enhance their findability and also to facilitate engagement from researchers. Next slide. So here I'm naming some specific products that we have created based on these priorities. First is the OHL metadata manual. We built on the great work that had already been done by AREPR in terms of developing a metadata system that was very functional, that was also very relatable to the communities they were working with, and that made overall sense for the work they were conducting. And the folks at AREPR were extremely kind in terms of sharing their metadata manual with us and giving us guidance when we were starting off. And that was essential in terms of giving us solid footing to begin our project. And it gave us a lot of peace of mind. Ultimately, we developed our own metadata manual for the OHL collection, which is available in English and Spanish versions. We also developed an online form to make it easier for students to submit metadata for their oral histories. This form really makes the process very more user-friendly for our students, and the form includes guidance on how to fill out the different metadata elements. And of course, it's always helpful that at the end with the form, we have the metadata stored in tabular format, which is great for doing batch uploads to the repository further down the line. Next slide. And these are some additional products. In order to enhance dissemination, we created 2 access points to the OHL's outputs. The main storage location for the oral histories is UPRM's institutional repository, but we also created an Omeka website as an additional gateway to the collection. And it is nice because the repository in the repository, we have oral histories housed in an environment with other UPRM academic products. So we highlight that connection with the institution, but we also have the Omeka site, which is exclusively dedicated to the OHL oral histories. And we have also taken steps to ensure an ethical archiving practice. This includes teaching students about ethics related to oral history, and of course, creating permission slips that narrators and interviewers use to express if they want their oral histories to be included in the OHL collection. Having the interviews deposited in the repository is totally optional for students participating in the OHL related courses. Narrators and interviewers can also indicate how they want to be identified once their interviews are made public. Either this can be full name, first name only, initials, or if they prefer to remain anonymous. And we also adhere to the principle of rolling consent. So if an interview participant at some point decides they want to have their interview taken down from our collection, we have agreed that we will comply with those requests. And in terms of digital preservation, we have adopted a series of policies and procedures to do our best to ensure long-term access to the items in our collection. And this includes, of course, the creation of backups, recording checksums to conduct integrity checks, regulating what file formats we want to include in the collection. We're favoring open, non-proprietary, and widely used formats, and establishing file naming conventions and organization schemes that help to avoid dissociation of information. So now we can go to the next slide, and I just wanted to give a quick look at an item in our Omeka collection. And we can go into this item for Sofia Perez Alers, who is one of the people interviewed by our students. And on the left, you can see the bilingual metadata scheme that we have created, where we have summaries in English and Spanish titles, English and Spanish keywords. And if you go to that element where it says source, there is a link to the repository, and that takes you to Scholar at UPRM, which is our institutional repository. So that way we have 2 gateways, but we have all the products kind of linked together. So that's it for me. So I'll pass it on to Christina.
Thank you, Jose. I was going to say apologies to Christina and Jose for misnaming them. I had COVID a couple of weeks ago, and it seems as though the way the lingering effect is for me is that I'm misnaming people terribly, but I think it might be catching. Maybe it's the Friday afternoon blues. Thank you very much, Jose, for explaining in such a nice way the work that we do at the OHL lab. As Jose said, one of the main elements of the work we're doing in the digital repository at the OHL is centering students. We talk a lot about teaching students how to use resources, but we don't necessarily talk to students about how their work, their research, and their experiential knowledge need to also be preserved and how those are also valuable and equally valuable. So one of the things that Jose and I and other people at the lab worked with quite a bit was how to articulate to students that the work they're doing, the research that they're conducting, and the collaborations that they have both on and off campus are extremely important, especially when we're moving into conversations about climate justice and the climate emergency, because at this point, our experiential knowledges are essential. And when we built the program with students, we understood that each student in our class is, first of all, a survivor of the things that are going on. And I would say that if you're not in a place that is yet experiencing climatological disaster to the same extent as we are, your students are survivors of COVID, or perhaps engaging in the ongoing global pandemic of COVID. And so they are experiential witnesses to these events. And so, as Jose said, they engage with the stories that are most important to them, in the places that are most important to them, and with the people who are most important to them. And they do this in a way that is perhaps more fluid than we as researchers at the university could do. And so this situating of students at the center of our archival practices led us to consider what would it look like if we were able to do something for our communities. And so the OHL is undertaking a new project, and it's a project that's going on right now. And so I'm not going to have a lot of outcome at this early stage because we are in the process, but we're trying to center our community partners as experiential experts in the climate crisis. And we're developing an idea that we, as oral historians who are working in the climate crisis, can't stop our work once the story is recorded. And so I think in a traditional model, we say, hi, I'm the oral historian. I have recorded the story. Jose, I hand it off to you and you preserve it. And then hopefully, if everything goes well, someone will find it there and somebody will be able to access that knowledge. And so if we think about the archival
I think we just lost her.
I think so. I'm hoping she'll be able to rejoin here in just a minute. Otherwise, I can jump in, or Jose can jump in.
Should we give her a minute?
Here, I will text her to make sure she knows she joined the call.
If not, I can jump in and talk a little bit about ACLS. Okay. So as Ricia mentioned, this is the project we are currently embarking on. The OHL has been in conversations with 4 community groups in different parts of the Puerto Rican archipelago. Oh, I see that Ricia is just arriving. Ricia, sorry, I was just jumping in, but I'll pass the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Jose. And as you can see in a conversation about climate justice, we're seeing what happens when a storm is about to pass by. And I'm just asking, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Okay, great, great. And so what I was saying, and apologies for that, what I was saying is that if we think about the traditional archival mandate is to preserve for 100 years, when we're doing climate justice work, we don't have 100 years. And so I believe that we need to refigure our process from inception, contemplating the storytelling for social justice project, through dissemination. And so for us, digitally disseminating work for both internal and external communities becomes essential. And so this project, and I'll try to wrap this section up quickly so that just in case the call is dropped again, we can move on to the next part. Within this project, we're working with 4 community partners across the Puerto Rican archipelago. We're working with Camji Lares in the Pueblo, Camji Lares in Bartolo, which is in the more mountainous region and brings together several mountain communities. We're working with Colectivo Perlarte, and we're looking at Fundación Culebra. What we have done is extensive needs assessment work with each of these 4 communities that lasted about 6 months. We first work with them to develop what their idea for a storytelling for climate justice project would be. Then we worked with them to determine what kind of a technology package they would need. And then finally, we worked with them to develop a series of online seminars for community partners about the different elements of our program: storytelling, preservation, and dissemination. Some of the types of projects that communities will be doing are geospatial mapping in the community with QRC codes as stickers so that people can trace stories throughout the physical neighborhood. In addition to that, we're working with another community on an almanac that will have a manifestation as a calendar, digital exhibitions, and then we're working with a playlist for a community that centers music as community building after climate disaster. And so what we're trying to do is work backwards a little bit and think, what is a digital output framed by the community that leads the community back to the repository, or leads somebody who's outside of the community back to their repository when they're in a position in which they need this essential experiential knowledge in order to understand how communities that are currently on the front line of the climate disaster are creatively responding to that disaster. This is a project that is sponsored by the American Council of Learned Societies, and Insight is also funding what we're referring to as mass listening days. I'm also referring to this as parties that center storytelling amongst food and music. What we're doing at those is we're setting up listening stations. The listening stations are a way for community members who are not participating in the longer oral history interviews, which can run 4 to 6 to 8 hours. It's a way to record a shorter narrative related to a specific or pointed question that will hopefully, 1, tie people to the project, but 2, expand our information set and expand what the community is holding on site in terms of the stories from their communities. I'm going to pass the mic now, and I'm going to turn off my camera in the hopes that I don't get kicked out of the rest of this call.
Hi all, so I'm gonna talk about AREPR a bit, and you're going to hear a lot of similarities to what Jose and Ricia have already shared. You can see that we've been working together for a long time. So AREPR, our approach with, well, I'm going to largely focus on 2 elements. So the approach we took with our team in Rio Piedras, as well as MSU's responsibilities in the project. So with our team in Rio Piedras, we asked around and found community groups that were interested in preserving oral histories and artifacts from 2017 on that included topics, as we've already discussed, things like hurricanes, the Puerto Rican earthquake swarm, COVID-19, but also stratified disasters like the crises caused by the Junta Fiscal, the closure of K-12 schools, and more, because we see these as all interlinked within the realm of disaster. Once we found our organizations that were interested in participating, we talked to them about what kinds of artifacts they wanted to collect, what kind of technological needs they had. And then we put together technology kits, which you can see on this slide here, that we mailed out. And then we worked with the students at the University of Puerto Rico and Rio Piedras and their affiliated community groups to make sure that they got familiar with how to use those kits. So with that team, we took a slightly different approach. Instead of a pedagogical approach where we worked through a course, we worked in this case with 5 student researchers. And each one of them was assigned a specific community group that they partnered with for 20 hours a week. In that role, they were able to learn things like, how do you conduct an oral history? How do you use a camera? How do you collect metadata? And so we use many of the same processes that were outlined earlier, things like a Google form for a metadata, a bilingual metadata form, both because we find it valuable to preserve our materials in the languages that our audience most uses, and also because we think it's really important for students to learn how to develop materials across languages, and we hope to serve as a model for other archival projects, as we know it's difficult to work across languages. And then also these students worked in some direct action as well. We did ask them about 5 hours a week to engage in work directly with the organization so they could get some on the ground experience working with, whether that be food distribution, building water filters, etc., that they could get their hands kind of on the elements that were being used to directly respond to the climate crisis. When we look at what those collections and those experiences resulted in, we can see that here's an example of one oral history that was collected. One thing that is very excited and that our MSU team was able to help support was building a custom Omeka-S theme that was designed specifically for bilingual collections. And so that is what we're seeing here. It includes the ability to have our video of our oral history and also a special, what Omeka calls a module, but in most places would be a plugin, like a WordPress plugin, that allows that transcript to be interactive on the right side. And so you can see there's a section of the transcript that's bolded. So that shows us where we are, where the speaker is in the conversation. And just above that, you can see Espanol, and there's a toggle feature to English. So if you choose to toggle, then the entire language of the transcript will switch. So you can view the materials in whichever language you prefer. And so this is really how our two teams, our team at Rio Piedras and our team at MSU, really worked together. Our team in Rio Piedras did a lot of the on-the-ground collecting of materials, and our MSU team was able to support that by developing technical solutions or working with we have a bilingual metadata librarian, very fortunately, who is able to help us ensure that our metadata was constructed properly. So this helped us live out some of the values that we've already talked about, that our whole team really abides by, which is making sure that our outputs are bilingual, user-friendly, accessible, and replicable. And this last one is really important to us. So not only do we want to build solutions that are useful for our team or our partners, but things like our metadata manual is available freely online. Our Omeka-S template is free to use. So we really want to build materials that make it possible for other community archiving projects to get off the ground and to be able to provide more stories in the world about the climate crisis and other crises that our world is facing currently. We were really excited that we were able to accomplish these goals through a participatory design approach. So every element of our project was built in deep conversation with our community partners. And that includes things like our custom vocabulary when it comes to our metadata, mapping our Library of Congress subject heading terms to make sure that our English and Spanish aligned in a way that our community partners thought the most representative of their experiences, and things like our Omeka S site. So what you can see here is actually on the left side are 2 sketches that our developer produced at the beginning of the project to ask community partners, do you like these? And then the image on the right is what the site looks like today, a screenshot of what that looks like today. So this is just a little bit of information about what we've been up to and what we've done, but I would encourage you to check out some of the resources on our resource page, which you can access here. And as I mentioned, we have a lot of similar values amongst our projects. So Ricia is going to wrap us up by bringing all of those together.
And so we thought that perhaps by gathering together a couple of the points and values that we share, it might be a good starting place for our discussion. And so we want to point out that we believe decolonizing the archives is valuable because it resituates participants as agental and offers one way for individuals to empower themselves through storytelling. By placing personal stories in conversation with other voices in the archive, participants become part of a collective pursuing both the dignity of being heard and climate justice for communities. And so we're very committed to the idea that our students and our community members are storytellers or potential storytellers. And when their stories come together, we create something larger and stronger. We achieve a decolonial model by including students and community members in archival repositories to feature their experiential knowledge and eyewitness testimony as essential for mitigating the climate crisis, thereby positioning them as knowledge producers and reframing whose lives and stories are given importance. Building connectivity to full repositories by creating curated capsule collections that function as bridges back to the archive, creating curated collections that function as independent text developed by and with community partners that emphasize patterns of knowledge triangulated across collected oral histories, and by implementing new technological approaches and developing new software to support these goals while maintaining an integrated high-tech, low-tech, and no-tech approach to serving all stakeholders. Thank you for attending our presentation, and we would be delighted if some discussion unfolds from it.